Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me for our day text reading. Sorry I'm a few minutes late, but there's just so much going on. And so I'm glad to at least have a few moments that I can share with you as we continue our readings in the book of Genesis. So we're going to be considering verses 9 through 13 today. And as you've probably noticed with the Genesis, or starting with the Genesis readings, I've begun labeling the day text descriptions a little bit, just so you have an idea of some of the main topics that will be our focus during the readings. And then it also allows them to be grouped together better topically. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about oceans, land, plants, and trees. Let's take a look, because some of it will tie directly into part of what I discussed previously back in the beginning, before the creation of sky heavens, the expanse, and the waters above and below the expanse, the separation. We talked a little bit about how during even that time, when there was no clear structure to the earth like there is today, because the waters were covering the earth and it was dark, but there was still structure in terms of the core, or whatever was used to hold up the oceans and gave it substance in that regard. It just didn't have the completed structure that it ended up having, or ends up having, once Jah is done. And then also the same structure that he left in place after the flood. So if you'd like more information on those subjects, see the prior videos in our Genesis readings. But let's get to this one. Let's go through the texts and we'll talk about them. I'll share a couple articles with you as well that tie into some of these issues. So Genesis 1, 9 through 13. I'm going to read the Hebrew translation, the translation of the Hebrew, and then the translation of the Greek. Now in our first verse, you're going to notice, and I will explain these things in the published translation that I do in terms of the foreword and what the symbols mean, but and in the online edition I have, I believe there's a little bit of an explanation to some of these things. But you're going to notice in verse 9, next to the H in the parentheses, a minus sign. And then you're going to see next to the G in the parentheses for verse 9, a plus sign. What that means is that in the texts that we have, the ones I'm translating from the Hebrew and Greek, sometimes there's additional material, usually in the Greek text, but not always. And it's not always additional material that we should consider as later or an added description, because there are times when we find texts, early Greek texts, that are consistent, more consistent, I should say, with early Hebrew Aramaic readings, or more consistent than with later Masoretic text readings. So we'll get to some of those examples later on. In this case, it's not really a significant difference. It's more a repetition of some of the same information. But this way, as we read it, you'll understand what that's about. Now, what I do in the translation, when I'm showing a plus, that means there's added material, in this case in the Greek text, and not necessarily added in the sense that it was not original, but there's more than in the Hebrew. And that's why there's a minus there. So there's nothing being taken away from the Hebrew text necessarily, unless we can show, based on earlier Hebrew Aramaic texts, that the bigger or more, the larger, longer Greek reading is more original. Either way, it gives you both. And then you can see for yourself all the differences, at least that I noted, in translating these texts. And so that's just a brief introduction to those symbols. And we'll talk more about it as more examples come up. Let's get to the reading. Oceans, land, plants, and trees. What's going on with sky heavens now that it's in place? So here we go. Verse 9, Hebrew translation. Then God said, the waters from below the sky heavens must be brought together into one specific location, and the land below the waters must appear. So it came about just like that. Now the Greek translation, same verse, verse 9 of Genesis 1. Then God said, the waters below the sky heavens must be gathered together into one shared location, and the dry ground must be seen. So it came about just like that. And now here's the additional part, which may or may not be original to this text. And the waters below the sky heavens were gathered together into their shared location, and the dry ground was seen. So it's basically more of a conclusive description addition. That is, it basically describes those things happening, in addition to stating it came about just like that. Verse 10, Hebrew translation. Then God began to call this land earth, and the collected waters God called seas. God saw that all of this was a good thing. Now, you'll note, perhaps as we read this, I'll make one brief comment, that in the beginning, 1:1, God made the heavens and the earth, right? So in one sense, the earth was already there. And as we noted in our earlier readings, Spirit of God was moving to and fro over the waters covered the deep. So the earth was, in that context, the actual planet itself. Here, it's the land being brought together, which is why we often refer to the earth in those same two respects. Greek translation, same verse, verse 10. Then God called the dry land or dry ground earth, and the arrangements of waters below the sky heavens God called seas. And God saw that all of this was good. And then I added a note, basically stating what I just mentioned, that this is not a reference to the earth, as in verse 1, but to the ground that's now visible as the waters are being pulled back from on over it. Verse 11, Hebrew translation. So God said, the earth must sprout grass. Plant growth must produce seed, yielding fruit trees which make fruit according to each tree type, which is based on the seed sown in each tree that is upon the earth. And it came about just like that. Then in verse 11, Greek translation, then God said, the earth must produce plant vegetation, sowing seed according to each plant type, and based on each plant's similarity, and productive trees making fruit, based on each tree's seed, which is in each tree according to its type upon the earth. So it came about just like that. Verse 12, Hebrew translation. Then the earth began to produce grass, plant growth, producing seed according to each plant type, and trees making fruit, which is based on the seed sown in each tree according to its type. God saw that all of this was a good thing. Verse 12, Greek translation. Then the earth produced plant vegetation, sowing seed according to each plant type. Sowing meaning planting or allowing for the planting of seed, bringing forth seed. Sowing seed according to each plant type and based on each plant's similarity. And the earth produced trees, making fruit based on each tree's seed, which is in each tree according to its type upon the earth. And God saw that all of this was good. Last verse, verse 13, Hebrew translation. Then there came to be a time for darkness and a time for light. This time for light was the third day. Verse 13, Greek translation. There came to be a time for darkness and a time for light. This time for light was a third day. So now we've completed 3 of the days of creation. None of them are taking place with cycles of the sun and moon and stars according to what we're reading so far, they're not even in existence. Or if they are, like the moon, they're not visible at this time. If the moon, for example, was created as part of the creation of the heavens and the earth, that just were not yet filled with stars and creating the photons that we ultimately see when they reach our Earth's atmosphere as light. So we have the atmosphere, we have Jah generating light or creating the electromagnetic spectrum. So the expanse is now here. The sky heavens is here. Waters are above and below the expanse. Light is here, as I just described, but without the luminaries acting as their source. Right now it's either Jah or how he's created the electromagnetic spectrum and keeping it working as he's bringing these things about, preparing the expanse for the waters, for the clouds, for the planets, for the stars. But before that, we're going to get to that real soon in our readings this week. But I'm pointing that out just to show again, there's nothing that would indicate these are 24-hour days. That's the things that we use, the sun, moon, and stars, and possibly even the way that the earth is at this time. We don't know whether it was tilted or what tilt it had or what rotation it had. We don't know. But even if we assumed it, and we don't even know if it moved at all. Maybe it's just being operated upon in without the motion other than the wind. I don't know. We're being given a description of things that resemble what we see in other planets, right? That aren't really made with any complete structure, but that have these winds blowing across the surface. So at this point now, we don't have anything that would allow for what we know to be, a time schedule like that. So that's why I say anyone who would tell you these are all these days, we'll get to the other days next, of course, but to this point, it's obvious 3 of these days of creation do not involve the things that we use to calculate a 24-hour day Earth cycle rotation, where we are given sunlight and nighttime during a 24-hour schedule. That's not here. So to say that that's what these are is reading into the text, right? We cannot say that. And there's no indication that that's what is happening at all. Because again, the things we use to indicate that are not there. So moving forward now into the text, we'll get to the planets and the stars and the cycles and rotation or the 24-hour schedule that we use later. But here we have the sky heavens. We have the waters above and below, but now the waters below are being acted upon. So it says in verse 9, they're being brought into a shared location or one specific location, which is described and called seas. It says that God actually called them seas. Later on, many of you are familiar with the account that we'll get to, where he lets Adam name the animals, right? I mean, he creates Adam with the vocalic expression and ability to express names based on what he sees. But he didn't program Adam to say this name for that and this name for that. He just had within him the ability to speak and say these things reactively. So John knew all the possibilities. But he waited and allowed Adam to react and respond and to name each one. But here, Adam's not here, right? So God names the earth. He's naming these things. He names the seas. We even call them seas today. Of course, there was an original word, but basically it stems from these historical references, at least in terms of our thinking and much of the world. We certainly see oceans and seas. We do separate them now, but again, more specifically, that's after the flood. But at this time, we're in a condition where all the seas are brought to what is called a shared location, meaning they're at least connected in one sense, but now there's land popping out from it. That was not happening before. The earth was below it in some way that's now visible, And so God calls that land earth. Basically what was made in the beginning, but the substance of it, the dirt, the land, the particulate matter that he's causing to rise or be visible as the waters are removed, cleared away, and for a purpose. That purpose is for plants, for vegetation, for fruit. Verse 11. So it talks about grass, plant growth, trees yielding fruit according to their type. And it goes on to describe essentially these things, all the vegetation of the earth. And we can imagine what it must have been like, right? Think back. It's unclear how long ago the dinosaurs actually lived. I mean, with their geologic timeline and the way they date fossils and things, they're millions of years back there, right? Well, let's set that aside for now. It appears pretty obvious either way that the plant growth required to support those massive creatures would have been incredible. I mean, it's incredible today. The Germans couldn't even drive through hedgerows in France because they were so thick, just being 30 feet high with their tanks. They got tangled into them. Tanks! So here we have these massive dinosaurs roaming the earth with all... Could you imagine the vegetation that must have been there? When you see some of these dinosaur shows, you know, like on Discovery and these other planet shows, and they talk about the dinosaurs, what you know what stands out to me the most? No plant growth. It's almost always in here come the cats, a desert of some kind, or just a forest. You know, they'll show T-Rex in like a normal forest. Oh man, they must have had massive trees, redwood type or otherwise, and then other plant growth. We've seen paleobotany, paleo plants in terms of fossil form. But just imagine how much and how massive the plant growth during the dinosaurs must have been. And if the dinosaurs existed from this time, or once the creatures are made and into the time up to the flood, potentially, we'll get into that later. Well, then you can see why all this vegetation and plants and trees and fruit-bearing seed would have been just like the way it's described in Eden, a paradise or a garden of God, something luxurious in ways meant to support life and to give glory to Jah because of its design and correspondence with the creatures that he will be making. I get caught between saying present versus future because we're doing the reading. But now let's go from the dinosaurs to the modern time and consider just a couple things, because I wrote an article back in 2013. I'll just share it with you briefly here, called Evolution Issues, Seeds, Plants, and Trees. I was doing at one point like a little series. I did several articles called Evolution Issues, and I was going to make a little like a little tract. I still probably will, something more out of them. But one of them in June 2013 is this Seeds, Plants, and Trees. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let me just share a part of it with you, because it's very interesting when you consider things from an evolutionary perspective, right? We often talk about evolution in terms of biological evolution of humans or mammals or creatures and their change over time, and whether or not it's possible for them to create new species, you know, right? Not new types within types, but like whole new species that are fully functional and have utility with their environment, which does not happen. That's not possible. You can't even interbreed cross species. They have to be related on some level. Although humans can get involved on a genetic level and you know, mess things up, but that's not normal reproduction. So it would require even humans to which are intelligent creatures, right? It's kind of like the Miller-Urey issue on the amino acids. If you require the humans to make something, then you can't say they were made accidentally. Period. So that ends that on any level when it comes to scientists saying, we made this, so it could have happened accidentally. No, as you just said, you made this. So far, it couldn't be made accidentally. That's the whole Miller-Urey flaw in a nutshell. But it really applies to pretty much everything else when they make those claims. So, but now let's talk about plants and seeds, because how is it that seeds are getting into the earth? Ask yourself that question. And if you're an evolutionist, someone who believes in evolution, that is the accidental formation of life over time, non-intelligent design, basically, and of course the source of life that was a one-time non-living, unless you believe like me that life is eternal because we're here now, and life only comes from things non-living. Just looking outside my window. Either way, tell me how you get seeds in the ground. Not happening. Seeds are not just evolving out of nothing. And trees and plants don't evolve out of nothing. That's why the whole, they're starting to get into these different theories, and have been for decades, really. Even Francis Crick, one of the discoverers of the DNA, double helix, I believe, believed in kind of a panspermia, where there's like these seeds that come from the heavens or from space and that, land on Earth and create these things and life even. Either way, that would require the seeds or whatever's coming from outer space to actually be in a condition where it could unfold and make these things, right? So they're basically in those cases saying there's these seeds out there that have the power to unfold as soon as they hit dirt that happens to now be visible above the oceans. And so these seeds are getting through this atmosphere and somehow, getting in the dirt, and that's how these things and even potentially life came about. But that doesn't fit the evidence, right? We're not seeing those kinds of things happening now. And the fact is that when you consider seeds, there's really no way to account for them. None. They're basically contained. Well, I don't want to say computer programs, right? Because we make the computer programs, which are like seeds with all this data inside that open up once they're activated. Now, we turn the computer on, we open up the program, and boom, it starts going. You put a seed in the ground, you add some water, you talk about growing. Look at all this stuff. I mean, I just highlighted a few examples of trees. Looks like one of my plant growth images phased out there. I'll replace that. Fruit. I mean, I just gave a couple examples, and I talked a little bit about how, evolving seeds is just not possible. I mean, it never happens. How would that happen? How would a seed, it's like with the cell, right? The same argument, basically. How do you get the cell unless you contain it and then make it? Because if you don't have the cell doesn't exist, right? So the cell can't just pop out of nothing. It's got all of these components and things that on a microscopic level are like little factories and things, and mitochondria, all the stuff. And then you have the cell wall, right, holding it together. Well, so did it just evolve as a cell? I mean, there's nothing that shows that level of evolution taking place. And that'd be pretty amazing if it did. And then you have the seeds, right? So how do you get a seed just coming together and having all that data in it so that it opens up into these things? I mean, come on. These are way beyond computer programs that we ourselves have to make, right? They're not, the computer programs aren't evolving on their own. We make them. Who do you think's making these? And the seeds and all these things? I mean, the only evolution we ever do, other than the kind that Miller-Urey and try to do in labs and things like that, is when we breed things like dogs and cats from creatures that are of the same type, right? But we're doing that. We're involved in that kind of evolution even. So that's why I believe Jah has also been doing similar things when it comes to animals, as we'll talk about. Changing them from one type to another dinosaur types to mammal types, but they all have a similarity, but just different to fit the new environment, the conditions that exist. But these plants, seeds, and trees, I mean, we ignore a ton of evidence that Jah is real, that God exists. I mean, we have the whole life from life. Life only comes from life, so therefore life's eternal equation. We can show life's intelligent from all these things, but what about these things? The seeds, the plants, the trees. Let me share one other article that I reference here at the beginning. Right here, this brief but powerful article. It's right here. It's an article back from 2011. And remember, I wrote this article in 2013. But in 2013, when I read this 2011 article, square roots, scientists say plants are good at math. Read this brief article with me and then we'll wrap things up. Plants do complex arithmetic calculations to make sure they have enough food to get them through the night. New research published in the Journal of Life shows, or eLife, sorry. The text is a little faded in my view. Scientists at Britain's John Innes Center said plants adjust their rate of starch consumption to prevent starvation during the night when they are unable to feed themselves with energy from the sun. They can even compensate for an unexpected early night. Compensate for an unexpected early night. That's intelligence. This is the first concrete example in a fundamental biological process of such a sophisticated arithmetic calculation. Mathematical modeler Martin Howard. During the night, mechanisms inside the leaf measure the size of the starch store and estimate the length of time until dawn. We can't. Do we do? I guess we do that, but maybe not as good as these plants are doing. We pretty much have to determine the amount of food we need during each day too, right? I mean, we measure it according to morning, noon, and night for the most part. So they're doing the same thing. And in fact, I should have just kept reading. Information about time comes from an internal clock, similar to the human body clock. The capacity to perform arithmetic calculation is vital for plant growth and productivity, GIC metabolic biologist Allison Smith said. Understanding how plants continue to grow in the dark could help unlock new ways to boost crop yield. So with this, I mean, this is linked here in my article, but now that we know they do complex arithmetic calculations, estimate the amount of food similar to what we do in terms of even having a biological clock, well, when you read these texts now, how are you going to look at plants? It's just some dumb piece of foliage out there? Not me. Not anymore. I mean, I've always appreciated leaves and trees, and they almost, I tell you, at times when I'm still on a quiet day and there's a light breeze and I'm near trees, I start to realize that the leaves are designed for the wind. They protect the tree and its vital parts from the sun as well and are involved in the whole photosynthesis process. But there's something about the leaves that allow for the wind to go through them in a way that I believe is creating a sound that the creatures, the birds, and others who interpret these things can get a sense of what's coming. I think that's in part how they're able to sense changes from far away, because the trees are telling them, or rather, the wind as it goes through the trees gives off such a subtle difference in vibration or sound, they know. Even we do. I mean, we can tell when it's high winds and stuff. So my point is, they have that on a higher level. Everything is working together, and they're smart. They're doing a complex set of arithmetic calculations to make it through the night, to continue doing what they're doing, so that we can have life, so that we can breathe oxygen, and we can give off carbon dioxide, which they need to continue to survive too. All of these things are perfect in their balance. And they show, they're proof that an intelligent life exists and made all these things. And if you look at history, and when you read these texts, there's one God who stands out above all of them, in my opinion, in every single way. Jah.